that. Here we go. 3, 2, 1.
Boom, and welcome to the Big Honker Podcast, brought to you by Gundog Outdoors. I'm Jeff Stanfield with the world-famous Andy Shaver.
It is July now, so it is time to get those dogs out there and get them in shape.
It's after
I'm
July.
I'm talking to myself more than anybody.
It's after
Jeff.
July 4th, too.
It is. Next holiday is what?
Opening day of dove
Labor
season.
Day? Opening day of dove season?
Opening day of dove season.
Now, go ahead and introduce our guests, and then we'll...
Online with us today from Kathleen, Oregon. No, Washington. Kathleen, Washington. I fuck everything up all the time. Retired U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Head of Migratory Bird Management. So he's the man, so we're going to ask him questions. We're going to talk about hip, but I got some questions about pintails and specklebellies. Mr. Brad Bortner. Brad, how are you doing, sir?
I'm doing well, Jeff. And I thought the next holiday was opening day.
It is for
yeah.
us. That's Andy forgot about that.
Yeah, no, that's what I was going to ask you. Do you have is that what your next holiday is up there? September 1, getting rocking and rolling.
Yep. September 1. September 1. East side of the state has pretty good mourning dove populations as long as we don't get a cold.
Do y'all have Eurasian doves there also?
I just hit one with a pellet gun about an hour ago. Dog
so y'all do have them up there. Now, I'm going to ask you this before we get into hip. On the Eurasian doves, I've always been told that those doves started out on a small island in Florida, and they move about 7 miles every year. And is there any truth to that?
Boy, I don't know how they were introduced, but they watching them come across the country was spectacular. They moved more than 7 miles a year. It seems to me that they were here one day, and I mean they were not here one day, and they were here the next.
Where did they originate from? Was it in Florida?
Eggs.
Eggs. That's a good safe answer there.
That's fair enough. Did we have them out here 20 years ago?
No.
We
got them about 15 years ago. We started seeing them, and now they're everywhere. But so they're all the way in Oregon. So are they all over the United States now?
Wow.
Yeah. Yep. All the way to the West Coast.
And they will break eggs in other birds' nests. Is that true, or is that a wives' tale?
I've not heard that they'll do that. I mean, most of them are just pretty mellow birds, but they sing like crazy.
I mean, I guess them and mourning dove get along just fine. They're not battling over territory.
You know, I don't know. I've wondered if they compete for food or nest sites because you certainly see they've certainly exploded. I don't know anyone who's studied them very closely and see if there is any interaction between the mourning doves and collared doves.
And why is there's no season on them? Why is that? Just because there's.
Because well, this will give you the 101 version is the Migratory Bird Treaty with Canada signed in 1918 protected migratory birds by family, and the subsequent treaties with Mexico, Russia, and Japan actually spell out the species. And since the Eurasian collared dove, like the mute swan, were not listed on the treaties, the federal government has no jurisdiction over them, so they're not protected. It's up to if a state wants to protect them, they can protect them. Same thing with English sparrows and starlings.
So there's a treaty with Mexico with as far as birds.
Mm-hmm.
What the hell bird is on their list?
They have a whole bunch of birds that down in your country, mass duck, white-winged doves. There was a whole bunch of birds that came over in the Mexico Treaty.
Really?
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, okay, you talk a lot about blue-winged teal and how important they are. After September 15th where they all are. They're south of you, right? They're in Mexico and all the way down into South America. And so in 1936, the United States signed a treaty with Mexico to protect migratory birds.
That's interesting. I knew that we shoot green-winged teal or blue-winged teal all the way till October. Our teal season starts and ends about the last weekend in September now, and we'll have some blue-winged teal, but we don't see. I mean, after that, you don't see them in regular duck season. And our duck season opens. We a lot of times we'll open the last weekend in October, and if it's a warm fall, you might still shoot a blue-winged teal every once in a while, but very rare. But we won't. During hunting season, I don't think we've killed some cinnamon teal. Every year we've killed a cinnamon teal the last 5 years. Before that, we didn't hardly ever shoot a cinnamon teal. But we have not shot a mature blue-winged teal ever.
When I've been banding them up in Saskatchewan, literally the last week of August, you'll go from having all these fat little male blue-winged teal, and then overnight, one night, they're all gone. And then almost immediately we start getting recoveries everywhere from North Dakota to Texas. So some of them, hightailed out of the North Country, and they're down in your neck of the woods probably in a week or two.
Before we get to hip, I got another question. It's about coots. Have we ever in the world seen them fly? Because I never have seen them migrate.
They the old wives' tale is they just spend the winter in the mud in your mud hole. But that's why they're called mud hens. But they migrate. They migrate at night. That's one of the other wives' tales out there. There's lots of stories about migratory birds. Migratory birds have fascinated people since people started recording their thoughts. There's written records from the ancient Greeks, Aristotle and folks recording stories about migratory birds and asking where they go during the winter, that sort of thing. So humans have always been fascinated by migratory birds, and coots one of those ones. It's like, have you ever seen them walk down the highway? They got to migrate somehow.
I don't know if they're causing traffic jams that we just don't see or not getting recorded or what.
So when do the coots, they do it at nighttime, you said? And do they fly high altitudes too?
No, they're not particularly high. I didn't prep myself with a bunch of coot information beforehand, but I could probably look all that up in the scientific literature.
I was curious about that because we wake up in October and we got all these coots here, and you never see them flying. I've never ever. Every duck out there in a flock has been mistaken for something. I've never said someone, "Oh, that's a flock of coots coming in."
Right.
From up high. We've never seen them.
Yeah. No, they're moving at night. I'll tell you the strangest place to see them. If you go to the golf courses in Nevada, Las Vegas or down into Phoenix and everything else, the coots love those golf courses. There's water out in the middle of the desert, water and green grass, and the coots just cover them.
They're a nasty looking animal. Ugh. They're creepy. Those red eyes and
you got to try banding them. They'll rip your fingers off.
They got these feet on them that are just out of a horror movie.
Well, don't stick your finger in their bill.
Really? Ooh,
that's interesting. All right, let's get to hip. Everybody, when you fill out a hunting license, has to fill out a hip, and it's a pain in the rear for some people.
It's not a pain in the rear.
Well, some people just don't like to fill out stuff, but it's something you have to do. If you do it online, you do it. You're the chief administrator, or was, for this. Tell us why it's so important.
So, HIP is a cooperative program between the state and federal government. As I just kind of alluded to, the federal government has jurisdiction over migratory birds, but the states have the licensing authority over hunters, and they cooperate to collect information. And so we can determine how many migratory birds are being taken, and in some cases, what species, what sex or age they are, and all of that feeds directly into understanding what's going on with the population. As you know, it's been 2 years since we've had the aerial survey done in May, So this year we're looking, this year again we're looking at the sources of data that the agencies have for managing birds, and it's banding information and the information that hunters submit, through HIP, and HIP provides the framework for doing the harvest survey.
So
when you fill out your name and address, you also get asked a couple questions, 4 or 5 questions about, did you hunt last year, and how many birds did you take? And what that does is that information is used to sample in a more efficient manner hunters out there. So they'll follow that up with a questionnaire to a selected number of hunters. And in some cases, hunters are asked to submit wings and tail feathers from ducks and geese and doves and other species.
what if you don't have the wings and tails from these?
Then you can't estimate. Then you can't determine what the species composition of the harvest is, or the age and sex. So the age is important, so you can look at productivity. You want to know how many young ducks were produced this year. Looking at those wings, you can trained biologists can tell whether it's an adult bird or young of the year.
So how is there any gauge on how many people answer these questions, like honestly, like to the closest estimate of their imagination on how many birds they killed the year before, or are most guys just putting a number down?
Well, see, that's part of the problem, and why I'm involved in this is that in some states we know that 70% of the people that are getting their HIP registration answer the question that they didn't hunt migratory birds last year. Now, does that make any sense to you? Yeah, and why would you be getting HIP?
Every year.
Jeff, you and Andy, you guys deal with a lot of hunters. How many brand new hunters do you get? On a year? Is it 10%? Is it 15% of your hunters?
It's not 70,
or is it smaller?
It's not 70%.
It's not 70%. Yeah, and so it's either a combination of hunters just sitting there saying, I didn't shoot any last year because they don't understand what's in it, or when you go to the Walmart or the sporting goods store, I don't mean to pick on any one vendor, but the clerk doesn't ask the questions, or the clerk just puts in a 0 for you and moves on to the next hunter. And so one of the things that I'm trying to do is explain to hunters why they should answer those questions, take the extra few seconds to answer those questions, and how important that is to hunters.
So should guys should they have like a logbook of what they did the year before, or how do you think that they should?
Those questions are not the survey. All it is trying to figure out how avid you are. So if you are a guy who shoots over 30 ducks a year, it's more important for to get you into the sample, and then the Fish and Wildlife Service will send you either a link to a website or a paper copy of a diary and ask you to record how many ducks or how many birds you shot that per day through the season, and you just keep track of it. But those questions that you're asked at the when you buy your license are not the survey, and it's important that you answer that. In that, if you kill 300 ducks a year and you say you don't kill any, and you get sampled in that little group that says we don't shoot any ducks, you're and not to get into the statistics, but your participation in that group of birds blows up the estimate. It causes a lot of variability. If you can think about it this way, if you have a bunch of people that shoot 0 or 1 or 2, and one person who shoots 300, what does it do to the average? Or the median. You can remember all the stories about medians and means, and it skews the sample. So all those questions is just to sit there and say which pot do we put you in, the ones that are very successful, or the ones that are not too successful.
So are people, do they have like their tinfoil hat on when it comes to hip? Like, are there some people that are like, I don't want the federal government knowing my business or, knowing how many birds I kill? Is there any of that attitude?
Oh yeah. I've heard people say that, I don't want the federal government knowing how many ducks I shoot. All of a sudden, I'm going to have a law enforcement agent knocking on my door, looking in my freezer. I've heard that, if I tell them how successful I am, they're going to, the regulations are going to become more restrictive. All of that, okay, I'll take the law enforcement one first. That information is not turned over to law enforcement for law enforcement purposes. And so while I can understand why people are skeptical and concerned, there is no basis in reality for that concern. On the other concern that I hear from people is that the information is going to be used against us, and the hunting regulations are going to be more restrictive. Well, the harvest information, the harvest estimates are directly feed in a number of different strategies for harvest strategies for migratory birds: mourning doves, pintails, canvasbacks, and some of the Canada goose species. So getting good information on those is critical. And I think you guys have, in one of your podcasts, I heard you talk about coming up with estimates for number of Canada geese there in Texas that flying over or something like that. Well, one of the other uses for your harvest information, and not to get into the math of it, but is you can use the harvest information, a harvest estimate, and the banding information basically to come up with a population estimate. And that also feeds into good, proper management and setting appropriate hunting regulations. So I think it's in hunters' best interest, to participate in HIP, to understand, if you got questions about HIP, talk to a professional, talk to one of us, and happy to explain it to people, and why it's in the best interest for hunters to do that. Most hunters I talk to say, if I knew what the information is going to be used for, I'd participate. But most of them don't. Flat out tell you that Fish and Wildlife Service has done a poor job, and a lot of the state agencies have done a poor job of explaining to hunters why the information is important and what they're doing with it.
Let me ask you this.
And so,
Jeff, 25 years ago, when we were first in business, they shot a bunch of net-collared speckle bellies. That's all they shot. They went out pass shooting, and if they saw a net collar, they would shoot that's what they would shoot. Well, they reported them all. So with that information and, say he was off on what he reported to HIP, would that have had any bearing? Because the following year, they dropped our limit down to 1, correct?
Yes, we went from 3 birds to 1 bird. Speckle
bellies.
Well, there's a couple different issues that I need to unpack it there. Purposely targeting marked birds. And I'll start with that one. So, biologists put markers, bands on birds, mark net collars, whatever, on birds to mark a representative group, and those markers are not supposed to change the. I'm trying not to talk like a statistician here. They're not supposed to change. They're supposed to represent the rest of the population. So if you go out and only shoot net-collared birds and banded birds, what it appears that the harvest pressure on that population is higher than it really is. And so, I'm trying to think of a good analogy, for your listeners. But, you're basically, if you go out and band 100 or net collar 100 geese and 90% of them, 90 of them get shot, all of a sudden it looks like the harvest rate's 90% of the birds. And so then the biologists or the managers start getting nervous and going, whoa, what's going on here? and I don't know enough of the specifics of Jeff's situation with mid-continent white fronts on whether that was that fed into the decision making, but the harvest estimates would be used, coming from HIP, and the neck collar information would be used in management. But also those white fronts that you're getting are also counted up in Saskatchewan every fall, and so the combination of all that information may have led to that. But I suspect it probably happened that there was a bust in production, bad year in the Arctic, and they didn't make any young, and it triggered some sort of management response. But I'd have to go back and look at the data and the old regulations to figure out what the decision was and why. I doubt it had anything to do specifically with the number of white fronts that you shot there and reported either on HIP or through your neck collars. But I would not encourage hunters to go out and target marked birds, specifically, because it inflates the harvest estimate on that group of birds.
But that is the case that they're going to do that forever because it's a trophy. Now, my guides were all, I was 25, 26 years old, and all my guides were too, just about. So we were young, and everybody what would happen is we had a ton of neck collared specks here then, and we would shoot. You could pick out a speck all the time. I mean, it was easy to do. You'd have the client shoot their birds, then you'd wait to shoot your bird. And I always thought that kind of was one of the reasons we got held down to one for so long. And I think they micromanage our area for some reason more than a lot of other areas, because I've been told that our birds come from a certain specific area. I think somewhere in Alaska actually is where they come from.
None of it.
Is it none of it where they come from?
That's where all the bands, any band that we report, it shows it from. None of it.
And so
90% of the time.
And so, but regardless of that, I don't have we get 2 specks now. I'd like to see us have just 3 dark geese. I'd like to see I'd like us, when I first got in business, which would have been the mid-90s, we could shoot 3 dark birds. No matter if it was a speck in Canada, it was perfect storm. I love that. I wish we'd go to that to get today again. Would be my dream. It probably ain't never going to happen, but that's what I'd like. But back to your HIP stuff. So the people that think that when you fill out that deal that you're signing a binding document that's good in court, that's not the case, is what you're saying.
No, and it is basically asking the hunters to identify how avid they are and how successful they are, and that is just a way to separate hunters into successful, average, and then not too average, or not too successful, just starting out. And then from there they go to a survey, but even participation in a survey is not a legal binding document, Jeff. You have to sign the bottom of your license to the state that's saying that you are who you say you are, but that's not it's not the case when you're participating in a survey.
The questions for HIP. So I hadn't bought a license in almost a year now. It says, did you hunt waterfowl last year, right? And you answer yes or no. Migratory
did you hunt migratory birds last year? And then, and then if you say yes, then the question is, how many ducks did you shoot? 0 to 10, 10 to 30, or more than 30?
And then it says geese.
And then the same for geese, and then the same for mourning doves, and the same for sandhill cranes, and in East Texas, you may have woodcock hunters. You'll be asked how many woodcock you shot, or how many coots, rails, and snipe, gallinules. All of those are jurisdictional migratory birds that, the reason the rail question is on there.
That was my next question. Is snipe and rail.
Yeah. So, how many people do you know that hunt sniper rails? Well, there are a few out there, but you can imagine if we had to send every duck hunter in the country or every goose hunter in the country a questionnaire saying, "Did you hunt sniper rails?" how hard it would be to find the guys that are actually harvesting snipe and rails. And so, if a hunter just sits there and says, "Yeah, I hunt sniping rails, and I shot 30 of them last year. They're the guys that are going to get asked, how many did you kill? Because there are so few people that actually hunt those species. And so there's what I was talking about, efficiency, efficiency in sampling. Otherwise, the Fish and Wildlife Service would be sending hundreds of thousands of surveys out there to find the 10 guys who hunt rails.
Where do they shoot rails at?
Mainly in the Atlantic and Mississippi and the Pacific. I mean, not the Pacific, the Central Flyway. The rail season's actually closed in the Pacific Flyway because there are a couple of endangered species. But it's a traditional hunt on the Atlantic coast and even down into the south.
I always thought snipe was a made-up bird that like people take you out and.
I tried to kill a snipe for fucking 2 years. We used to have a pond by our house that had like flooded area on it. And I'm talking about when I was 10, 12 years old and I had a BB gun. I hunted that sucker all the time. There's a pair of them, and I never could. They're smart birds.
I know a lot of people who, a fair number of people who like to hunt snipe. It's a wet meadow bird. You walk out in the wet meadow, and if you get a pointing dog, dogs will point them. Labs have fun chasing them. But it's something to do. I do it on some of the islands here on the river at low tide. When the ducks aren't flying, you go out and hunt snipe at low tide, and if you can, you can get into them. There is a famous outdoor writer lives down in Oregon, Worth Matheson, if you know Worth. But he's written a number of books about waterfowling, and he is a big snipe hunter. He used to make my phone ring all the time and ask us, where are the snipe, and can you change the regulations to improve the snipe hunting?
But when I was growing up, Jeff screwing with us, snipe hunting, you would go out there and how would you do that?
Well, the best one I ever got involved with was when I was in Boy Scouts, and so I tried to do it with the boys. Is they made us take sacks or like the old paper sacks you'd buy at the grocery store, and they'd take it and they'd go in the bush. The guys would, and they'd get in front of us and they'd push the birds to us. Well, what they did was they would take a piece of a stick or something, and they'd throw it in your bag, and they'd throw pecans at it from behind it, and you'd think they were running at you, and you try to stop it. Well, me being growing up hunting, once we caught our first snipe, I was ready to do that shit all night long. I thought I had a snipe in the bag, and they had us all picture of us all holding paper sacks, and we had freaking sticks in our damn bag, but we all thought they were a bird. And then when we got out, we found it was a fake deal. Well, I always thought that was the coolest shit ever to do to somebody.
So that's how I got brought up. That's what I always thought a snipe was. And then I'd fill out this survey, and it's asking me if I shot snipe, and I'm like, no, doesn't exist, zero. And I move on to the next question. Gotcha, federal government.
What's it called? Is it called Wilson snipe? Is that what they're called?
Yeah. They're Wilson snipe. Yeah, I always I thought you were going to tell the story of on Boy Scouts is being taken out in the middle of the night at midnight with a stick in a bag and trying to round them up, and then finding out that you're in the middle of the Girl Scout camp.
I've heard the stick in the bag, but I hadn't heard it doing it in the Girl Scouts. But
yeah, I hadn't either. But it's a
real deal. It's a real bird.
Snipe's a real bird. But I did after that. We had a place that had some on them, and I tried to shoot them suckers, and I never ever could. But I also had a BB gun, and I went with shotgun. It was just when it was in town too. What go ahead.
You ever been over in East Texas and hunted woodcock?
No, but
Louisiana?
I know some guys that do that.
Yeah, it's about the same, except the snipe happen to be out more in an open field than in brushy habitat.
We talked about the coots for a little bit. I'm going to go back to the coots on this. There are some people, especially in southern Louisiana, coon asses love to eat them things, the gizzards and stuff on them. Do you have a population of people that hunt them everywhere other than southern Louisiana that actually target coots?
I've heard of people who some groups that hunt them. Some ethnic groups that hunt them more than other. And not all of them are Cajun, but regionally it's important in some places, and in other places it's just a bird out there. I'm not sure whether people shoot them by mistake or there's something for your on a slow day that you let the 10-year-old kid shoot at because there are no ducks flying. I don't know, but They're a legal game bird, and there's nothing wrong with
What's
taking
the
them.
limit, like 15 on them?
Yeah, is their numbers increasing every year because nobody shoots them hardly, or do they stay pretty level?
Actually, they've been declining, somewhat, modestly, as habitat, disappears and that sort of thing. I think the populations were higher 30 or 40 years ago than they are now, but they're certainly abundant and still, healthy enough to harvest.
Are speckle bellies, I mean, are their numbers just insane right now? Because I hear of so many people that did not have specks 10 years ago, they're seeing specks take over.
Well, a lot of some of that you have to separate out changes in distribution. So you're familiar with the Katy Prairie and things don't look like they used to in the Katy Prairie, do they? No, and so birds are moving into new locations, and so there's maybe some appearance that you got specks in Arkansas or specks in West Texas or the Panhandle that didn't exist there before because they've had to find new habitats. But then you also have population growth. I can't, off the top of my head, remember what's happening with the mid-continent population that you're harvesting there, but the Pacific Coast population from coastal Alaska that comes to California and then Oregon and Idaho has been skyrocketing. I'm not sure what it is, but they've been growing, and the bag limits have been becoming more and more liberal every year. A good friend of mine in Texas says you can't swing a dead cat down here without killing a white front. In the Central Valley of California, there's all that rice and that rice ground, and the speckle bellies are enjoying that. And during the spring, they're moving up and hitting alfalfa fields in southern Oregon and all the way into Idaho. And I know the states have been getting a lot of complaints about the number of specks that are there.
I've got friends that are. I've got people that message me from like Ohio and Indiana, and they're saying like, "Listen, we never saw specks out here before, and all of a sudden they're here, and their numbers are getting more and more every year."
It wouldn't surprise me that if the mid-continent population is increasing also. It's certainly not at the numbers that snow geese are at, but they do seem to be becoming more numerous and more widespread.
Would you say that the snow goose conservation season is it failed in what it was hoping to do? Because I mean the numbers are just they're not changing.
It certainly hasn't reduced the population like they had hoped. Now, there's been some studies, and again, I've stopped following the literature as closely and not involved in the management decisions. But there have been some data in the last 5 years that they have changed the survival rate to some extent, but it certainly hasn't been enough to actually drive the population back down. So. Failed might be a strong word.
I'll give you that.
But I wouldn't say that it has been as successful as we hoped in reducing the size of the population. And certainly, the conservation seasons have attracted a lot of attention by hunters, and they're a challenging bird. I don't need to say that to you guys. You guys deal with it on a daily basis, but they getting smarter and smarter every year. And on the years that you don't have any young, seeing all those white birds must be difficult to get them down in gun range.
I admit, failed it was the wrong term. I should have said not had the desired or hoped for effect.
But back to that. I made a comment a couple times. Andy kind of grilled me on this, but I think they ought to just go to the damn tundra and just wipe out a million snow geese if that's what they need to fix. Just go up there, take ARs, whatever it's going to take, and
I think that would give hunters a terrible.
I'm not talking about hunters doing it. I'm talking about the federal government doing it, because if you're wanting to control something, that's what we need to do.
Well,
I think that's harsh.
Jeff, I mean, that was certainly some of the early discussions, but the federal government isn't going to do that because it's Canada.
Yeah, I understand that.
Right.
Yeah. And the Canadian government was not wild about that idea. They have, and I don't know how far they've gone with this, but they have been working with some of the native communities to do some harvesting up there and to try to increase the harvest on the breeding grounds. I think we were all hopeful that the conservation seasons would help control and be more effective in controlling the populations than they have been. But I think a mass culling or killing, whatever you want to call it, either on the wintering grounds or on the breeding grounds, may be effective, but boy, is going to be a public relations nightmare. Can you imagine going to one of your locations and saying, "See all these geese here? We're going to kill them all tomorrow."
The snow goose is a beautiful bird. Like, it's white. I think it would be, like you said, a public relations nightmare if PETA got a hold of that and just these beautiful white majestic birds are all just
So are we trying to fix the population, or are we trying to make some people happy? See, that's what's the problem with our country. One of them is we can't stomach the things that have to happen sometimes to fix things. That's why we have war problems that we didn't have back from World War II on, because we ended shit. If we've got a problem and the snow goose population is so big and detrimental to other species also, then we need to fix it. And if it means going out and killing 1 million snow geese somehow, no matter how you do it, to fix it, that's what we need to do. But we're worried about the social media. We're worried about the people, oh my gosh, they're killing these poor white majestic birds. Well, those white poor majestic birds are wiping out themselves and all the other species because they're taking over the tundra. Isn't that the problem? Is that their breeding grounds are getting so big they're taking it away from everything else?
Well, that was the concern was initially that they would damage the tundra, and I think there has been some evidence that it has. I think some of those concerns might have been not realized, and birds have spread out, and some of the habitat has been able to recover. Some of it is in bad shape, but I mean, as a matter of public policy, there's been ongoing discussions. There still continue to be ongoing discussions between the Canadian government, the U.S. government, and frankly, all the states and flyways and hunters groups and non-hunter groups and everything else. So it is it's a complex issue, Jeff. And I know it would be nice to be able to sit there and say this is the way it's going to be and this is what we're going to do, but it does. A lot of people have their voices and have to be heard. One of the things I did in when I was the migratory bird chief is I ended up having the discussion with Russia about snow geese. Russia and Japan. We have treaties with Russia and Japan, and we have seasons. We have Russian snow geese that winter in the Pacific flyway, and they were concerned that some of the conservation seasons and other things that were going on in North America were going to affect birds that were coming back to nest in Russia. And what Russia was doing at the time, it was trying to increase their snow goose population. They had been way reduced, and they actually stopped migrating to Japan. And so, they were trying to build the population up on Wrangel Island so it would start of migrating to Japan and also providing some opportunity in Russia. And so, there's always balances out there. We have treaties, they're treaty partners. We have to sit there and listen to them and have a discussion with them about the proper management. And at some point in time, we collect enough data that we can sit there and alleviate their concerns that we're having a negative impact on birds up there.
That's fascinating. That I've never thought about that. Like, if we've got a treaty with this other country, like, it's not just what's affected here in our country, but these other interests are involved in setting their limits and their dates. And and things like that. I've never in my life thought about that.
Well, having participated in those conversations, conversations with Mexico about goose management or even brant management on the Pacific coast with Mexico. So, those migratory birds, for some reason, don't pay attention to the international boundaries, and we have to deal with our international partners too. Because certainly, if they were doing things there that we didn't like, we would be talking to them also.
So, what happened in Japan? When was their heyday of snow geese, and what led to them not migrating? Was it Russia, or were they coming more into the United States?
As I remember the conversation, what happened is, for a variety of reasons, they went through a crash. The Russian breeding population went through a crash, and they were eliminated from nesting on the mainland, and they were only nesting on this one big island called Wrangel Island. And when that happened, that wiped out the most of the migration that went to Japan.
Wrangel Island.
Would you say, Jeff?
Looking it up, it's a big old island. Does that have open water around, or is that all froze up?
Most of the time, it's frozen up, but in the past 10 years or so, it's had more open water during the winter. During the summer, and they've actually had some cruise ships to go up there, and it's been interesting to see how things have changed up there. But I've got a friend who has worked up there, and they've even documented polar bears going through the snow goose colony up there eating snow goose eggs.
So what did we have to do in this situation? Did we have to look at the snow goose population that might be coming from Russia, or how do you ease Russia's concerns with our conservation season?
We've been doing banding of Russian birds, and on Wrangel Island, and they fly down either to British Columbia and Washington or to California, and you again start looking at what the harvest rate is on those birds, what proportion of those banded birds actually get shot, and where they get shot, and have that discussion with Russia, and it can show that harvest isn't overwhelming those species. That and their breeding population counts on Wrangel Island have continued to go up.
Do we have the best biologists in the world? Like whenever you talk to these other countries, is it? Are they on par with what we see in North America, or what?
The survey and monitoring program that we talk about, the May breeding waterfowl survey, the banding programs, the harvest programs, and the cooperative nature that we have with the states through the flyway system is the envy of the world. Nobody else has the information that we have for managing migratory birds, especially waterfowl. And so all those surveys flying around the Canadian prairies and U.S. prairies, all the way up to Alaska, the banding programs. I've been in Europe and Russia and talking to them about management, and they're like, we would love to have a system like that, but none of them have the capability of doing that to the extent that we do.
Just because they don't have the infrastructure, or why can't they pull it off?
Well, they don't. They're much smaller countries, and they don't have the infrastructure, the wherewithal, the coordination and cooperation between countries, and the financial resources to support that kind of system. And so, what happens in the U.S. and Canada between the two federal governments and all the state agencies is a real testament to waterfowl conservation in North America, and certainly the hunters are a big part of that.
Is Canada at all worried about what the snow goose population is doing? It is technically their, like you said, it's their tundra, it's their country.
They are, and they've incorporated a number of different. They have conservation seasons in places. They have done some of that to try to increase the harvest on snow geese. But yeah, they're concerned. They haven't gotten to the point yet where they want to go up and kill every snow goose that's on the tundra. There's still a lot of hope that that the system's going to be somewhat self-correcting without having a huge population crash or disease outbreak that's going to take out lots of other species besides snow geese.
Was that the thought several years ago, that if this goes unchecked, that it will have an effect on other species of birds?
There is some concern. Snow geese will concentrate, let's say, on the Platte River in Nebraska or other places with a bunch of other species, the specks that you're talking about, or the pintails, and then you've got a concentration, some sort of disease outbreak take place, and kill a lot of other species besides just snow geese. So that's certainly a concern.
Do you think that the conservation season has made the snow goose what it is today, like this creature that is damn near impossible to trick?
I think snow geese have always been difficult to hunt, even before the conservation seasons. And you guys are probably much more experienced snow goose hunters than I am. But I mean, Jeff, you've been around a while. Before the conservation seasons, they weren't easy then. A white bird, an adult bird that's seen more than one hunting season, they don't decoy well, whether it's the conservation season or just the regular season. And I can remember hunting snow geese in the early '80s, and if there weren't any gray birds around, it was pretty impossible to get them to come in and get them to decoy very well.
I went to Katy and hunted in 87, 88 probably, and I was so unimpressed with the snow goose then, because I was hunting up here, and if I saw a goose, we had a chance to kill the goose. Canada goose, you could decoy them or speckle belly. Well, I went down there, and you wasn't going to shoot snow geese. You were going to shoot specks, maybe a sandhill crane, and you might get lucky, and if it's foggy and windy or something, you might get a snow goose or two to come flying by, but you couldn't decoy a bird then. And we're going to get the snow goose guy. We decoy birds all the time, blah, 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 blah. That's not a fact. You may kill some snow geese, but the snow geese don't decoy like the Canada goose did, or we wouldn't have the problem we have. They're the smartest bird that we hunt. And especially when
and they've also really benefited from learning how to feed in fields. They used to be a coastal marsh bird and feed in marshes and dig around and root up roots and tubers and stuff. And now they're out eating waste grain in the fields.
When you said something earlier that touched on a really good point that I had never thought of, but it made a lot of sense. The Katy Prairie back in the day probably used to hold 5 million geese. Is that safe, or is that higher? Is that higher than what it is?
I don't have the specific number on my head, but it was a lot. It was a big waterfowl area.
And so those birds they're not there no more. I doubt the the Katy Prairie. I doubt it holds 100,000 birds nowadays. I don't have a clue, and someone's going to check me. They always do fact check us on this, but let's just say they hold 500,000 birds now. Well, there's 4.5 million birds that are having to go somewhere else now that used to go down there. And I think those birds are now in Arkansas, aren't they, most of them?
I think a lot of I've talked to guys down in Stuttgart and everything else, and boy, shooting specks has gone from non-existent to something almost as popular as hunting greenheads.
Yeah, and that wasn't the case 20 years ago.
No.
And a lot of those birds used to be on the Texas coast. And Louisiana's the same way, because they've taken away a lot of their grain and they've went to sugar cane. And that's one of the big problems in Louisiana. Everybody complains about them, the flooding corn and all that other stuff. Well, the problem in Louisiana is we haven't had any winter, and you got sugar cane now. And those two factors, and all the hurricanes we've had have really jacked up their marshes.
Yeah, that's kind of an interesting point. Also, is used to get hunters all the time complaining about, I had a terrible season. You said it was the most number of ducks ever. There are large scale landscape effects out there that change distribution of birds. Every year, every season, maybe even within the season, you probably had an influx of birds early last year because of that, that big blizzard that covered the Canadian prairies early on. That affects hunting success a whole lot more than people really, will commonly say. They'll sit there and say, well, your May number said it was the best year ever, but boy, I had a terrible duck season. Well, there's a lot else going on the landscape that affects, how successful your hunt's going to be besides what the breeding population estimate is.
Yeah, and I tell you another thing that we missed last year was the effect that having hunters in Canada was going to play on the year. Because I can remember this time last year, Canada was going to stay closed, and I just thought there's going to be all these birds. They're going to be untouched. They're going to, come down to us in droves. And we had that initial blast in October, and then it was a mild winter, and a lot of birds just stayed north. And I did not take that into account. I was wrong. I think we all were.
Yes.
Yeah, well, I think I heard Jeff earlier say that he was anticipating that this year, Kansas was going to be the beneficiary of whatever birds came out. I know you're getting a lot of water down your way. Maybe you'll have birds down there. It's certainly dried north of you, all the way down into Nebraska. It's hard to say where the birds are going to settle out this fall.
We have calendar birds that are here. I can tell you right now, we could have you on October 15th this year, and I'm going to have 25 to 50,000 specklebellies here. They come every year at the same time. Around October 15th, they show up, and they're here, and our great state of Texas and their wisdom have decided to move my goose season back to November 14th, which that's something completely I don't want to get you involved with. But we're going to have them birds here, and they always are. And it's calendar, and they increase every year. We get more and more of them. So it don't matter what the weather is. It can be 85 degrees, and those birds are going to be here. It can be 55 degrees. But there's something I wanted to talk about also on here that we were talking about. You said the geography or whatever is changing in areas. We have a very small version of that west of Wichita Falls right now. There's a guy that's purchased a bunch of brush country up there, and he's been putting wheat fields in. And it's right by Lake Diversion, and it's east of Lake Diversion a little bit. And he's bought everything up that comes up. He buys and changes it. He doesn't hunt that. Don't let nobody hunt it. There's 25 to 40,000 acres of wheat that he's put in over there. And that's holding a big portion of geese off of, because Lake Diversion is a private lake. The jackass that owns the Los Angeles Rams, I can't think of his name right now, Kroenke, bought the Wagner Ranch, which is 600,000 acres, and those lakes, he shut that lake down. Well, before people used to be able to duck and goose hunt on those lakes. That's a good-sized lake. I'm saying it's probably 25,000 acre lake, maybe 15 to 25,000 acre lake that nobody hunts. It's holding a bunch of Canada geese now, and they go right to that guy's wheat fields. So that's changed that whole area over there because nobody can hunt those birds. They go from a lake nobody can go to, and they go to all these wheat fields that nobody can hunt. And things like that change flyway a lot more than people realize.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, when you see some things like that go on, I've seen it in a number of different places, and all of a sudden something that was hot becomes not so hot, or something that where you never saw birds, all of a sudden start seeing birds, and you'll get some bleed over. Some birds will come off of those. All you can hope up there, Jeff, is that at some point in time, that segment of the population will start attracting more birds, and they'll have to start foraging out and flying out off of that ranch onto other property to find food or whatever else they want.
I know
other roost ponds or places for those birds to go. But that's a tough one.
It's like a refuge that one guy's controlling, and it's affecting the guys that are outfitters over there sometimes because they're having to wait that hopes those birds are going to feed off those fields. But we're talking, some of them wheat fields are 3, 4, 5, 6,000 acres. It takes a lot of geese a long time to eat 3 or 4, 5,000 acres of wheat when there's nobody jacking with them. And they don't even shoot them off with a rifle. A lot of places, your farmers and ranchers are going to run them off because they're cattle. The guy don't want nobody hunting on it and stuff, but it's causing an issue 100 miles east of here for those guys because they got to wait for those birds to get off them or to find somewhere else to go. And it's crazy. But when you talked about that a minute ago about how things change, that's changing that landscape over in that area a little bit in just one man.
Yeah, and then think about how that is playing out, all the way from the Montana border down to your neck of the woods. I mean, those kind of changes are happening. Reservoir goes in here or some other place goes dry. It changes the distribution of birds and the success of the hunters in that area. It
changes all the time. When I was first getting in the hunting business, and even before that, I think it's Lake Rita Blanca that's up by Dalhart or Dumas or some there. Used to hold a bunch of birds. There was a playa lake up there or a city reservoir or something that held a bunch of birds, and they had a population of 100,000 plus geese that stayed in that area, and it went dry. Well, then all of a sudden, those guys that used to hunt up there, those birds are gone, and they go shift 50 miles away somewhere. Well, I don't think those birds have ever went back to that area, but for years that was a stronghold, and man, weather, whatever it is, we see this, and I've noticed in my years in the business how the birds will move from one place to another. Like Arkansas right now is really, really hot on speckle bellies. 20 years from now, those specks are probably going to be somewhere else. Great Bend, Kansas used to hold a ton of small Canada geese. Those geese are in Wichita, Kansas now. Eventually, those birds are going to leave Wichita, Kansas and go somewhere else. It always happens. I mean, nobody would ever thought the Katy Prairie wouldn't hold geese like they do, but they don't no more. It's all houses now. But shit happens.
Yeah, well, things happen like that all the time. I mean, Louisiana used to have Canada geese. Used to have a pretty good population of Canada geese when I first got in this business, and that slowly started changing. The same thing happened on the on the Atlantic coast. Matamesquite of North Carolina, the area around Matamesquite National Wildlife Refuge, used to be, honker heaven in the Atlantic Flyway. And it's not nearly that anymore. You think of the Delmarva Peninsula, or even into Pennsylvania now is or even New Jersey is the places to get Canada geese on the Atlantic coast. And, south of North Carolina, you've got a few resident birds around, but you don't have the migrants coming down from Canada anymore. So with all these,
how do you go about, do you take everything into consideration? Number one, how is a limit set? So here it's we can have 5 dark geese, only 2 can be specks. In Oklahoma, it's 8 dark geese, and you can have a bonus spec, so you can shoot 9 darks potentially. How are these things set, and what involvement would you have in your old job in these things being set?
Okay, in a nutshell, all the states within a flyway get together. It's called a technical committee and the council, and so in each state has a technical person in charge of their migratory bird management, and they come to meetings every year. They've within a flyway have identified management populations. They have management plans written for each of those populations, and it tells them how they're going to count them, how many they're going to allow to be harvested, and what comes out of that is something called the federal frameworks. And that's the Fish and Wildlife Service would approve the federal framework, which is kind of the outside boundaries of saying, okay, you can hunt no more than 86 days. I'm just picking, and you can have no more than let's say eight darkies. I don't, right. I'm just making numbers up. And each state within the flyway now can pick the regulations that they want to apply in that state. Sometimes states are more conservative than the federal frameworks. They can't be more liberal, but they can be more conservative. And so a lot of it comes down to negotiations within that flyway, depending on whether we're talking about geese or ducks. Ducks are managed, a little more tightly with prescriptive regulations. you guys are probably familiar with adaptive harvest management, and there are packages, liberal, moderate, and restrictive, and there are set thresholds of number of ponds in the populations that say, okay, we're going to be in a liberal season, we're going to be in a restrictive season, or we're going to be in a moderate season. The goose regulations tend to be a little bit more individual to that flyway and to that management population, and subject to negotiation within that flyway. So not getting into the specifics of the birds that you're talking about, I would go back to the flyway management plan for that population and see what the decision criteria are. And as long as the flyway picks something that's in that management plan and written down, the federal government will basically approve it. And so what in my old job, since you asked the question, what I was in charge of is all of the biologists and statisticians and pilots that do all the surveys, crank all those numbers out, and look and see what's appropriate for the way of hunting regulations, and then those staff members of mine would interact with the flyways and say, yeah, that's appropriate, that's not appropriate, and would help bring those proposals into the federal government. And then there's the authority for setting seasons is sent to the Secretary of Interior, and the Secretary defers that to the Director of the Fish and Wildlife Service. And the Director has a group of 4 regional directors for the Fish and Wildlife Service and 2 people from every flyway that basically discuss the regulatory proposals and either accept them or not. And my staff, when I was the migratory bird chief, would provide the biological input, saying this is within the regulations or within the biological parameters for that population. It's an appropriate regulation or it's not appropriate. And so we used to always advise the decision makers on what was best biology. They would take into account all the other factors that they needed to take into account, whether or not there was some ambiguity, some state that was adamant that they needed a change, or in the case of some things, whether or not it needed to go to a higher level politically.
Excuse me. For Oklahoma to have a limit of 8 dark geese, does that imply that the entire Central Flyway is okay with 8 dark geese for their limit, and then other states like Texas have said no, we're going to do 5 and it's 3 and 2? Did I misunderstand that?
It's probably written down in the flyway management plan for that population. And I don't, are you talking about, is it tallgrass prairie Canada geese, or you're talking about specks, or
I think it's a
mixture
of the two. So
that may be something negotiated out within the flyway. I'd have to talk to the technical folks to find out exactly how they ended up with that mix of for Texas. It may be that the harvest rates are so much higher in Texas than they are in Oklahoma. You probably have a whole lot more hunters, and that may be why. It's probably not something that is dictated by the federal government, but some sort of realization of what the harvest pressure is in Texas versus Oklahoma.
Because Texas is such a bigger state and there's more hunters here, so that would make sense. In your old job, was it hard to talk to politicians? I mean, how many politicians that you would deal with were hunters, and having to explain things, to where they would kind of grasp it?
There were quite a few hunters. I certainly talked to a lot of politicians. I spent a lot of time on the Hill and other places. but once you lay things out to them, they pretty much understood what you were what the issues were and why things were the way they were. What happens a lot of time is the squeaky wheel gets some attention, but once you explain that to them, to the politicians, they understand that, okay, sometimes you have a squeaky wheel that's squeaking even though it has enough grease, and sometimes they sit there and say, well, there's some other problem, and you go and you work out some of those things. It's hard to generalize on without getting into any specific cases, but sometimes I dealt with a bunch of issues with too many cormorants and or too many black vultures. And once you dig into those things, you can find out, okay, this is why the congressman's hearing what he's hearing, or he or she is hearing what they're hearing, and get down and find out what the specifics are. And then there's things you can actually, concrete things you can actually do. Within hunting regulations, the flyway system is an amazingly successful program where all the states get together, the Fish and Wildlife Service, and they kind of negotiate out, things that are acceptable on a flyway basis. And I always encourage them, let's walk together and come in with a regulations package that's going to be successful, and not have to avoid getting politicians or avoid getting politicians and everyone else, because you never know. Once you lose control, if you push that decision off to somebody else, you lose control of that decision. And if you're in a fighting mode, then you don't know what decision you're going to get. It may be one you like, or it may be one you don't like. And so let's work together to get to a point where we both like it and agree on that, and we'll be much more successful than if we're at loggerheads.
So what was your career path to eventually get the job that you had? Where did you have to start out, and how'd you get to Washington?
I started out as a junior biologist, and worked my way up. I started off at Patuxent Wildlife Research Center in Maryland, right out of graduate school, and did a couple of years as the woodcock specialist, working primarily on management issues for woodcock, and then started working on waterfowl, and then a supervisory position came along, and then another promotion to the regional chief of migratory birds in the Pacific region, which everything from California, Oregon, Washington, Idaho, Nevada, and the Pacific Islands. And I did that for a number of years. And then there was a retirement in Washington, D.C. And as much as I didn't want to move to Washington, D.C., I knew it was my turn to in the frying pan. And I went back and did that with the encouragement of my wife and family. Is like, you've been doing this for 30 years. It's your turn. You should do this. And at the time, budgets were being cut, and I decided, well, instead of sitting in out in the field complaining about what the budgets, who's cutting the budgets and what the budgets were being, what decisions were being made, I decided it was my turn to go in and make those decisions, and people could be mad at me instead. But I would be happy.
Makes sense.
Why were budgets being cut? Were we just running?
We were giving too much money to foreign countries.
Well, 2009, you remember what happened?
Yeah.
Yeah, and so we were going through a period of cutting budgets. Even if you had support from the administration, budgets were being cut. So there was less money in the system, and that's a whole nother. The congressional budget process is a whole nother story. What I don't have time to talk to you about today, but yeah. So when you're faced with taking a 10% cut, somebody's got to make that decision, and I thought it would be somebody who had the experience that I had, that I'd be much more comfortable than having somebody who was brand new or some other person who wasn't familiar with the program or the priorities that I saw.
They promoted
so
from
I
within.
went and
That's
did
a good thing. You're dealing with the biggest snakes in the world in Washington, D.C., and smart people. I mean, we rip on our politicians all the time, but they're the smartest people in our country, not because they have brains. They were smart enough to trick dumbasses like us into voting them in to where they control stuff. But they are. I mean, you take when you listen, we got a lady in Texas, Sheila Jackson Lee. She graduated from Yale University. She's a freaking idiot. But she represents the inner city of Houston. She don't have nothing to do with those people, but she's a smart lady or she wouldn't be where she is. And you're dealing with them snakes in Washington, D.C., and they're all out to make themselves wealthy, and they spending our money. And I'm glad to see someone like you get promoted from within and knows what he's doing, because I know a lot of people in Washington, D.C. are running different, I don't know what the word I would be, entities, whatever it is, that have no clue what they're doing, but they've been promoted because they're somebody's nephew or something. So it's good to see them at least promote from within.
Well, some of that, Jeff, I'll avoid talking about.
I don't blame you.
But I appreciate you saying that that you. I did enjoy. I felt personally. I mean, waterfowl and migratory birds have been my life. I've from a kid, I decided when I was a junior in high school that I wanted to be a waterfowl biologist, and pinch me, it happened. And I've been very, very blessed in my career. You can probably see decoys around the background and everything else. Those all up there are retirement gifts. There's birds up here. There's the first two canvasbacks that when we went to a 2-bird bag limit right there. Those are harlequins, up there that were shot in Alaska and Washington. So I feel very fortunate to have been able to live my dream, continue to waterfowl hunt, but also being involved in management, and then continuing on in retirement now. Trying to talk to hunters about how important they are in the whole system and why they're beneficiaries of the system. They also are the contributors, and they're why we do a lot of what we do. And I'd just like to clarify to them that they're important, and the data that they provide is important. Certainly, a lot of people managing waterfowl or migratory birds for them. Just to hook that back into HIP a little bit.
How important is HIP the last 2 years? Now that we're going on 2 years without a survey, correct? So how important is accurate data with HIP?
Extremely. As you kind of laid out earlier, the migratory, for ducks, there's the May survey, and then there's banding information, and then there's HIP. Well, outside of ducks, we're really down to harvest information and banding data for geese, for mourning doves, for sandhill cranes, for all those other species. And in some cases, it's only the harvest information. And so it's critically important for the management of migratory birds. It tells us how many hunters are out there and how successful they are, how many birds they're harvesting. And, and in some cases, how many young are out there versus how many old. So you have some index on how the populations are doing. And as Jeff kind of alluded to earlier, there are some people in America that don't like hunting. Mm-hmm. And having good biological data to support that this is a sustainable use of birds is critical. And not only that, it helps set the seasons and manage them properly. And I think hunters surely must realize that it's in their own best interest to participate and provide information.
Yeah. I don't know that enough do. I really don't. Just some of the knuckleheads that I see come through here, I really, it has not been laid out, especially hasn't been laid out to me, how important this survey is that you filling out my license, I just kind of like, okay, here's something else I got to do. But I've never conceptualized, and especially now that we're not doing the survey the last 2 years, how important it is for the future of our sport.
Yeah. It, like I said, I'm doing this as a retirement kind of fun gig because I was around when we designed HIP, and I've always felt that it's really important to have good harvest information. And you're in the Central Flyway, and the Central Flyway has been relying more and more on using the harvest estimates in with banding data to actually come up with population estimates, especially for those goose populations that you're talking about. And so having good harvest information is critical just for you and all the folks that come to see you. With mourning doves, you run a lot of mourning dove hunters through there, and the harvest strategy for mourning doves specifically is addressed uses HIP data for setting what the seasons should be, and having imprecise numbers just makes it more difficult and causes more concern. So having a precise number and an estimate that you could have more faith in certainly is in the best interest of managers and I think hunters also. So I can't stress it enough that I think that hunters shouldn't be afraid of HIP. And should, if you go to a store, you buy your license, and the clerk doesn't ask you the questions, ask to have those questions asked and answer them, and trust the system a little bit. It's not gonna bite you.
So we're gonna start wrapping up here. How do you sniff out the bullshit that people will document on HIP? Like, how do you see, like, oh no, that guy's, or is there a way? Do you have to take them at what they're reporting?
Well, are you talking about on the first 5 questions that get asked at the
first 5?
Yeah, those. I mean, again, those are just for grouping hunters into different pots, into different. Saying, okay, here's a duck hunter who's very successful, or here's a duck hunter that's not as successful, or here's someone who's just picked it up for the first time, or he only goes once or twice a year, and. Think about it. If we surveyed every hunter that shot 30 or more ducks per year, you'd get a much better estimate of the total harvest than if you surveyed just the guys who hunted and shot 0 to 10. I mean, think about the variation in the answers, and so. You can design a much more efficient survey. So, I mean, I'm not sure why a hunter would sit there and BS on the number of those first 5 questions. You either hunted them and killed a few, or you hunted them and you killed a bunch. And if your name gets drawn, you'll get a follow-up survey in the mail, and then they ask you to provide, actual day by day, how many birds did you shoot, and you'll get a diary that is much more, and that gets compiled anonymously with all the other hunters in your state, in your flyway, and in the country to sit there and say, oh, well, we shot 4 million ducks last year. 2 million of them were, more than that, but 2 million of them were mallards, and then 150,000 blue-winged teal, or whatever the numbers are, and so I don't see what the motivation is to BS on any of that. Is like, okay, let's let the states and the Fish and Wildlife Service know exactly what was done, and we'll go from there.
Go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Go ahead, Jeff.
The HIP numbers, like on dove hunters, that's kind of skewed because there's more dove hunters in Texas than any other kind of hunters, I think, because there's so many guys that dove hunt that never hunt anything else. They go out a corporate hunt, and so those numbers would be skewed. But I would think guys that are duck hunters would be about as close to accurate as you're going to get if you could get everybody to answer you, because duck hunting is a passion unlike any other kind of hunting there is. I don't think there's anything equal to duck hunting, especially anywhere in the United States for any other hobby.
I wouldn't argue with you, but I'm hoping that your listeners include some of those dove hunters and those sandhill crane hunters and those goose hunters, also, and so those guys that are going out in the corporate dove hunt understand why they're being asked the question. I used to get letters from deer hunters saying, "Why are you asking me how many ducks I shot? I never shot a duck in my life." And what it was is that somewhere along the line they clicked hip, and didn't know that they. But then they'd get mad at us for wasting money to survey them, and finding the right pool of hunters to survey is critical. And even if it is the corporate dove hunter or the passionate diehard duck hunter, they provide valuable information to the survey, and I hope that they would participate in HIP.
Is sandhill crane the biggest increase in? I guess it's not hunters, but there's more sandhill cranes killed now than ever in history. Would you say that's probably popular. Safe?
It's more popular
to say.
It's become much more popular, yeah.
Oh,
but the populations are doing much better also.
And we're shooting more than ever, so hunting numbers really does not affect the waterfowl as much as everybody thinks it does it? What we actually harvest.
Well, that was exactly what I was trying to tell you about, with what the flyway system's about and all the data that gets collected in these surveys and everything else, is to keep hunting at an appropriate level and not affect the populations, and being able to prove it in court to some federal judge. Those data streams are critical. And so having the May survey or having the harvest information or having banding information have basically proven, and the managers work on it, that we're keeping this at an appropriate level where we're not hurting the populations, and it's sustainable, which is a bunch of fancy ways of saying, the system works. Mm-hmm. And, people are, hunters help feed the system to maintain that system, and they're not hurting the populations as long as we have good information to manage it. And so, it's just as likely that, people are concerned that, HIP information is going to be used against them. It's just as likely it's going to be used to maintain the hunting seasons or even liberalize them as it is to restrict them. So that's why I was saying, when hunters say it's going to be used against me, well, they don't understand how it's also benefits them, and I want them to understand how it benefits them.
I think most outfitters in America are okay with a lesser limit. The guy who hunts on his own wants a more liberal limit. I wouldn't have a problem at all, like in Oklahoma, if we went to a 5-bird limit. I wouldn't care in Texas if we went to a 3-bird limit, just for anything. The crane hunting at 3, I think, is a good limit for it. So I think.
Well, I'm not advocating that we become more restrictive or more liberal. I'm just saying if we have the best information, we have good information, we can make the best decisions on what the appropriate regulations are. And so I would encourage, you and all of your listeners to make sure that, as especially guys like Andy and everything else, as you get hunters in the blind, make sure that they've filled out the HIP information and they can answer the questions to other hunters why it's important and why they ought to do that, participate. And once you understand the management better, you can understand what its role is in the industry that you're participating in.
One last question before we get you off here from me, and then Andy may have another one. Completely nothing to do with HIP. The social media. We see more and more pictures on social media, and I've noticed a huge amount of pictures of Eurasian widgeons the last couple of years, especially on the West Coast. Has that population increasing, or is it just social media we're seeing?
Well, I'm going to go off my own personal opinion. We don't have any data, but I certainly seen the same thing, Jeff, and I suspect that there are Eurasian widgeon that are not migrating in from Asia, but but are actually, you know, I don't know, being hatched somewhere in Alaska, in the Aleutians, somewhere here on the North American continent, not necessarily flying in from Asia, because the population has been, well, at least you see them much more frequently than you have in the past. So they may be here on breeding in North America now.
All right, my last question. It comes from your neck of the woods, up in Oregon. There's an initiative that would ban hunting, trapping, and fishing. And let me see if I can find it.
Did you say fishing?
Hang on, let me find it. Yep. Potential ballot initiative in Oregon aims to end all hunting, fishing, and trapping. It is the Oregon Initiative Petition 13. And I mean, it goes over all sorts of things. If you're a rancher or a farmer, you would not be able to slaughter a cow. The cow would have to die of natural causes. Is there any concern that something like that could be the law of the land?
Well, I can tell you, I'm sure there's concern. I can tell you that, from my personal opinion, that there isn't a chance that would ever pass. I mean, if you think of Oregon, you automatically probably think of salmon or steelhead or fishing for trout, or ranching or elk hunting or deer hunting. Those are all huge concerns for people in Oregon, and I can't imagine that anyone outside of maybe northwest Portland would vote for that initiative. I'm sure that is going to be dead on arrival. I mean, it might be a ballot initiative, but ballot initiatives in Oregon and Washington tend to be a dime a dozen. Certainly bad stuff happens at times, but I can't imagine that the voters in Oregon would pass a ballot initiative banning hunting and fishing, or any of those things that you talk about, for domestic animals.
So what is this, the stage that it's in, the ballot initiative petition? Do they have to get enough signatures for it to go to the ballot, or how does that work?
Yeah, they have to get X number of signatures on an initiative, then a petition, and then it gets put on as a ballot initiative, and then you have to get a majority on the vote. But boy, I can't imagine that there's enough people even in Portland that would vote for something that broad where it would actually pass. That would be like having all the people in Houston and Dallas, Fort Worth, vote that you can't have red dust in Texas. It's not going to happen.
So there's a lot of steps that this thing has to go through before it becomes a potential problem.
Yeah, I'm not an expert in it. Until you brought it up, I hadn't heard of it, but boy, it's awfully sweeping.
Oh, yeah.
And my gut tells me that there is no way that if what you've read is accurate, there's no way that they'll ever pass and become law in Oregon.
Well, it was on Facebook, so it had to be true.
That's why I'm not on Facebook.
Well, listen, we have really appreciated your time, and you've answered a lot of questions, and this has been a pleasure. I did not know HIP was as important as it is, but I applaud you in your fight here, and I encourage more hunters to take it seriously and answer the questions and participate in the survey if they get drawn.
Be truthful and be honest. We appreciate you being on here. God bless you. You take care of yourself and have a great summer, and I hope it'll cool down for y'all out there a little bit.
Oof.
Well, it's there's a lot of fires going on, and we're close enough to the ocean here; it's not too bad. But I just had a friend deployed at midnight last night to a fire on the east side, so it's happening. But sir, I appreciate you, both of you, having me on, and I wish you have a very successful hunting season, whether doves or cranes or ducks or geese. It's been a pleasure. I've really appreciated it, and encourage all of your hunters and listeners to participate in HIP. Enjoy the resource. It's a great thing to do, and I'm certainly going to be out. I've got a brand new one-year-old puppy who's going to be out is every day I can possibly get him out.
Very good. If
you all have a good fall.
To Texas, you got a spot here in the blind with us. So be safe, and
I'd love to do that, Andy.
Right,
we'll see
you.
you.
You have a great day. Bye.
Yep. Bye.
I beat it.
You did this time, didn't you?
Oh wait, yeah, I did.
Interesting man.
Yeah.
The head cheese.
Head cheese.
You know, a guy like that's got common sense, good guy, having to deal with them damn politicians.
It's tough. It is. I'm sure it was an uphill battle.
I bet every freaking day because there's so many anti-hunters out there.
What'd I just do?
I have no clue.
Oh.
What'd you do?
I think I hit stop.
So we're not recording?
Well, this is. But.
Okay. All right. Well, God bless everyone. Thank y'all for listening. We will announce the winner of the Clay Reed deal on our next podcast. We will have it announced.
Did anybody from the shirt giveaway?
Yes. Two people got a hold of me. I can't remember. Rick did, and
yeah, that person.
I can't remember the names of them who won now. I can look up my notes. I've got it.
I know that Ricklowski did because I saw he liked the post.
He's friends with another guy that won too.
Oh,
they're
really?
Gonna try to come the same time. Max, maybe.
I don't know.
I think it's Max.
Well, great.
I can't remember. I got so much stuff.
All right, that was a lot of fun, ladies and gentlemen. Hope you enjoyed it.
I'm trying to look up and see. I think I've got the names right here again, and we'll announce it again on who won again. If we can find the damn. You put it on the podcast page, didn't you?
I did not.
Okay. Anyways, two of the three have got a hold of me. I'll track down the other guy.
All right, boys and girls, have a good one. Thank everybody for listening. Check out Pacific Calls. Check out Gundog Outdoors, Dive Bomb Industries, Boss Shot Shells, Dirty Duck Coffee, Lucky Duck, Looking Glass Duck Club, Eyesight Drone Service, Bangtail Whiskey, Goose Creek Retrievers, and Stanfield Hunting Outdoors.